The day we buried my daughter, I didn't eat a single thing. People kept bringing food: casseroles, pound cakes, fried chicken in aluminum pans covered with foil. My neighbors set a whole pot of collard greens on my kitchen counter, and I smiled and said thank you, and I never touched it. I just stood at the window in my black dress and watched the cars pull away from the curb one by one until the street was empty and quiet, and it was just me and the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Lena was 34 years old. The official report said she lost control of her car on Highway 19 sometime around 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in January. Black ice, they said. Happens every winter out that way. The guardrail didn't hold and her car went down the embankment into the creek. By the time anyone found her, it was too late. My son-in-law, her husband, a man named Douglas, he cried at the funeral. Loud, heaving sobs that made people reach over and pat his shoulder. Everyone said he was devastated. Everyone said what a tragedy for that poor young man. I stood at the graveside and watched him, and I felt something I couldn't name. Not grief exactly. Something colder. Something that sat in my chest like a stone. I had been a registered nurse for 31 years. I retired at 62. I know what grief looks like on a person's face. I know what shock looks like. I know the difference between a man who has lost something and a man who is performing loss for an audience. I told myself I was wrong. I told myself I was a mother who had just buried her child, and I was looking for someone to blame because the alternative, that my daughter simply drove off a road in the dark, was too senseless to accept. I went home and I sat in the dark and I told myself to let it go. Then Lena's landlord called me. I should explain. Before Lena married Douglas, she had her own apartment across town, a little two-bedroom on Sycamore Street, that she rented from a retired school teacher named Mr. Alcott. She'd lived there for almost 6 years before she moved in with Douglas, and even after the wedding she'd kept a small storage unit in the building. Boxes of her mother's things. She'd told me. Some furniture she couldn't fit in the new houses. Mr. Alcott was 71 years old, and he'd known Lena since she first moved in at 26. He'd watched her grow up, in a way. He called me 14 days after the funeral. It was a Thursday evening, just past 6. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this. I know you're grieving." I told him it was all right. "I was cleaning out the storage unit," he said, "getting it ready to rent again." I hope that's okay." He was nervous. I could hear it. I told him yes, of course, I understood. "Well," he said, and then he stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "I found something in one of the boxes that I think you need to see. Not over the phone. In person." Another pause. "I need you to come by the building. And Mrs. Hargrove, please don't mention this to your son-in-law." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I drove to Sycamore Street. Mr. Alcott met me at the door before I even knocked, like he'd been watching for my car. He was a thin man with white hair and reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead. He led me down to the storage room without saying much, and unlocked the door and pointed to a box on the second shelf. A standard banker's box with a lid, Lena's name written on the side in her own handwriting. "I wasn't trying to snoop," he said quickly. "The lid came loose when I was moving it. Papers fell out, I gathered them back up, and then I saw what they were." He looked at me over his glasses. "I've been holding on to that box ever since." I took the lid off. Inside there were 3 things. The first was a folder. Inside the folder were bank statements. Not from Lena's personal checking account, which I recognized from years of helping her with her taxes. These were statements from a joint savings account I had never known about, an account in both her name and Douglas's. The deposits were regular and substantial. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, amounts between $800 and $1,200. The second thing was a legal document, a life insurance policy. Lena had taken it out 18 months before she died. The beneficiary was Douglas. The payout was $420,000. The third thing was a notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you buy at a drugstore. Lena's handwriting filled every page. I sat down on a folding chair and I read it. It took me almost 2 hours. Mr. Alcott brought me a cup of coffee at some point and I barely noticed. I just kept turning pages. My daughter had been afraid of her husband for over a year. She didn't use the word abuse. Lena was precise with language. She'd been an English teacher before she switched to working in HR, and she wrote about what was happening in her marriage the way she might have written an incident report. Dates, times, specific things Douglas said and did, the way he monitored her phone, The way he'd started controlling the money, moving funds around without telling her, insisting she run every purchase by him first. The way he'd gotten angry in December when she mentioned visiting me for Christmas, and what had happened after. She wrote that she had tried to open her own bank account in November and Douglas had found out. She wrote that he'd told her if she ever left him, he'd make sure she didn't have anything. She wrote, "I don't know what that means exactly. I'm scared to find out." Near the end of the notebook, about 6 weeks before she died, she'd written something that made me set the pages down and just breathe for a minute. "He took out a second policy last week. I wasn't supposed to know. Mel from his office mentioned it without realizing I didn't know. When I asked Douglas about it, he laughed and said it was just financial planning. He was so calm about it. That calm is what scares me. I've been thinking about leaving. I keep waiting for the right moment. I need to get my things out first. I need to be careful." She never got her things out. There was no right moment. I sat in that storage room on Sycamore Street with my daughter's words in my lap, and I understood, with the kind of certainty that doesn't argue with itself, that my daughter had not died in an accident. I want to be honest with you. The weeks that followed were not like something from a movie. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have connections or resources. What I had was 31 years of watching people in crisis, and the particular stubbornness that comes from raising 2 kids mostly on your own after my husband passed. I wasn't going to go to the police with a notebook and a folder of bank statements and a feeling in my chest. I knew what they would say. I had already talked to the detective assigned to Lena's case twice in the weeks after her death, and both times I'd come away feeling like I was a grieving mother who needed to be gently redirected. "Black ice," they said. "Tragic accident, these things happen." So I started small. I called my friend Odessa, who had worked 30 years as a paralegal before she retired, and knows more about documentations than anyone I've ever met. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked her to help me understand what a life insurance claim looks like, how the process works, what a beneficiary has to do to collect. She told me. She also told me that insurance companies do their own investigations before releasing funds on large policies, especially recent ones. She said there were things that could flag a claim for review. I wrote all of it down. Then I called my nephew Curtis. Curtis works in IT for a logistics company, and he is the kind of person who knows how every system works before he ever has to ask. I told him I needed to understand something about car accidents and black ice, and whether there was any way to know, after the fact, if a car had behaved strangely before it went off a road. He asked me a few questions and told me that modern cars, Lena drove a 2021 Honda, have something called an event data recorder, like a black box on an airplane. It captures speed, braking, steering input in the seconds before impact. He said, "Did anyone pull that data?" I said I didn't know. He said, "They should have." I went back to the detective, not with accusations this time. I just asked casually, the way you ask when you're a retired nurse, who knows how to keep her voice steady, whether the vehicle's data recorder had been analyzed as part of the investigation. The detective checked his notes. He said it had been requested, but that the vehicle was significantly damaged and they'd been unable to retrieve usable data. I thanked him and hung up and sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you something about Douglas during this period. He came to see me twice in the month after the funeral. Both times he was very kind. He brought flowers the first time, yellow roses, which were Lena's favorites, which he knew. He sat at my kitchen table and talked about how much he missed her. He talked about the life insurance claim like it was an afterthought, just something he had to deal with, paperwork on top of grief. He said the insurance company was being slow, and it was frustrating. He said he might have to get a lawyer involved. I poured him coffee and I listened and I said all the right things. The second time he came, there was a moment when his phone rang and he stepped outside to take the call. I was in the kitchen and I could hear him through the screen door, not the words but the tone. Low and tight, the way a person sounds when they're being pressed. When he came back inside, his jaw was set differently. He picked up his coffee cup and he said, without looking at me, "You know Lena had some debts I didn't know about. Found out recently. Couple of old credit cards from before we got married." He shook his head. "Surprised me." I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "Well," he shrugged. "It is what it is." He was laying groundwork. I understood that. He was starting to build a story about Lena that would explain the money, Explain any discrepancies? She's preempt questions. I had spent 3 decades reading patients' charts and listening to families describe symptoms, and I knew when someone was telling me the story they'd prepared instead of the thing that was actually true. After he left, I called Odessa and told her everything. Odessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sylvia, you cannot do this by yourself." I told her I wasn't doing anything, I was just paying attention. She said, "You need to call that detective again. This time, don't ask about car data. Tell him about the notebook." I didn't want to do that yet. The notebook was mine. It was Lena's words and it was mine to protect until I knew it would go somewhere and not get set aside. But Odessa was right that I couldn't manage this alone, and what she said next was what changed things. She said she knew someone, a former colleague from her paralegal days, a woman who now worked as a victim's advocate in the DA's office in our county, not a detective, not law enforcement. Someone who helped families navigate exactly these kinds of situations, who could look at what I had and tell me honestly if it was enough to bring to someone who would listen. Her name was Ms. Beaumont. She agreed to meet me on a Wednesday morning at a coffee shop downtown. I brought the notebook, the bank statements, the insurance policy, and the notes I'd made from my conversations with Curtis about the event data recorder. Ms. Beaumont was somewhere in her late 40s, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of unhurried manner that makes you feel like she has all the time in the world even when she doesn't. She read through everything slowly. She asked me a series of questions. She took notes. When she was done, she looked up and said, "Can I ask you something first? What is it you want to happen here?" I said, "I want someone to look at this seriously. I want someone to look at how my daughter died and not just accept the first explanation." She nodded slowly. "The notebook," she said, "is significant. A contemporaneous record of fear and financial control with specific dates. The insurance policy is significant. The timing of the second policy, 6 weeks before her death, is significant." She paused. "What would make this more powerful is if there's any evidence he was communicating with someone else around that time. A second phone, emails, anything that suggests he was making plans." I thought about the phone call outside my door, the tight jaw. I thought about the account he'd moved money into, the one I didn't recognize from the statements. I said, "I think there may be another person involved." Ms. Beaumont said, "If there is, that changes things considerably." She told me she was going to bring this to the detective assigned to Lena's case, not as a grieving mother with a feeling, as an advocate with documentation. She said it might take time. She said she couldn't promise anything. But she also said that insurance fraud investigations often surface things that local police miss, and that she was going to make sure the right eyes saw this. I drove home and I sat on the porch, and I watched the sun go down over the back fence, and I talked to Lena the way I'd been talking to her every evening since January, just quietly, inside my head. I told her I hadn't forgotten. I told her I was trying. 2 months later, Curtis called me on a Sunday afternoon. He'd been doing some digging of his own, more than I'd asked for, more than I knew. He'd found something through channels I won't detail because honestly, I'm not sure all of it was strictly proper, and I don't want to know. What he found was this. Douglas had been sending money to a Venmo account for almost a year. The account belonged to a woman who lived in a city 40 minutes away. The payments had stopped in February, 3 weeks after Lena died. I called Ms. Beaumont that same evening. Within 2 weeks, the insurance company had flagged the claim for investigation. Within a month, the detective from Lena's case had been in contact with investigators from the state's Financial Crimes Unit. And approximately 6 weeks after Curtis's phone call, Douglas was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, fraud, and conspiracy. They found the woman. Her name doesn't matter, but she was real and she had been receiving money and she cooperated when the time came. Because that is often what happens when someone realizes they are about to go down with a person they thought they loved. The event data recorder, it turned out, had not been fully destroyed. A private forensic team brought in by the insurance company recovered partial data. Lena's car had not braked before it went off that road. There had been no steering input, no attempt to avoid. At 71 miles an hour on a stretch of road she had driven dozens of times, my daughter had simply gone straight off the edge. The trial is scheduled for the fall. I am not going to tell you that I feel at peace because I don't. I'm not sure I will. I think there are some things a person never recovers from, and losing a child is at the top of that list, and knowing it wasn't an accident only makes it different, not smaller. It doesn't shrink the size of the hole. But I think about something Lena wrote in the notebook, near the very first page, before she'd even moved in with Douglas. She was writing about why she loved teaching. She wrote, "The most important thing I can give a student is the belief that their voice matters, that what they observe and record and feel is real and worth defending." She was right about that. What she observed was real, it was worth defending. I just had to be the one to do it for her.